This is breakout session 2B, Building Electrification and How That Changed the Way We Live. I welcome you all to it, and I would like to introduce Lisa Dix, who will be our moderator today. She is a senior climate change professional and thought leader and is the New York director for the Building Decarbonization Coalition. The Building Decarbonization Coalition unites building industry stakeholders with energy providers, environmental and environmental justice organizations, labor, and local governments to help electrify homes and workspaces with clean energy. Through research, policy development, and campaigns, the BDC is pursuing fast, equitable action to accelerate the development of zero-emission homes and buildings that will cut one of New York's largest sources of climate pollution while creating safe and healthy, affordable communities. Lisa?
Hi everyone, and welcome. Today, we are going to dig in with some really amazing speakers and have a great conversation about how to electrify our homes and businesses in New York. The heating and cooling of our homes and buildings account for over 1/3 of the overall greenhouse gas emissions in the state of New York. New York's Climate and Community Protection Act established mandates that cut greenhouse gas emissions 40% by 2030 and 85% across the economy. The CLCPA also established a Climate Action Council tasked with providing a statewide plan to achieve the carbon reductions and equity mandates under the climate law. The Climate Action Council is considering an all-electric future for our business or for our buildings in the draft scoping plan. And to be on target with the state emissions mandates, we need to ensure that at least 2 million homes are all electric by 2030, ramp up investments and ensure existing home and businesses are electric ready, establish all new electric codes and standards, including appliance emissions reduction standards that eventually phase out fossil fuel appliances. So for this session, we're going to discuss the proposed plans and steps needed in this transition and how we learn from current programs to ensure affordable and equitable transition off of fossil fuels in our homes and buildings. So right now, I'm excited to introduce our excellent panel and speakers. First off, we have Janet Joseph, the Senior Vice President for Strategy and Market Development for NYSERDA. Janet leads NYSERDA's work in building decarbonization and advancing programs and policy to deliver a carbon neutral building stock for New York. Chris Halfnight from Urban Green is the policy director and leads Urban Green's policy development and advocacy, working with stakeholders and policymakers to advance energy efficiency and building decarbonization in New York City and in the state of New York. And I'd like to introduce Sarah Berger from Push Buffalo. Sarah is the Sustainability and Planning Manager. She works on implementing solutions towards equitable decarbonization of our homes and our neighborhoods. She manages Push's solar arrays, Push for Clean Heat campaign, and provides technical support to Push's community development team. So it's great to welcome everyone here. I want to just start off with a first round of questions. And my first question is for Janet. Can you give us a high-level overview of the recommendations and timelines that came out of the EE and Housing panel and that are in front of the Climate Action Council now, with really a little bit of detail and flavor for, from your and the state perspectives? What are the necessary and immediate steps the state needs to take this year?
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. And it's great to be here to participate with this panel on this very important topic to our climate agenda. So as Lisa mentioned, the Climate Action Council is in the process, as we speak, of pulling together a draft set of recommendations on strategies to decarbonize New York's economy consistent with the climate law. And those are the reductions of 40% by the end of this decade and 85% by mid-century. So the Climate Action Council is scheduled to release those draft recommendations within the next 8 weeks. And as Lisa pointed to, the transformation that we need in buildings is really quite enormous. We have 6 million buildings in New York State, and the vast majority of these buildings will need to be retrofitted in some way, shape, or form to comply with the Climate Act. I had the pleasure of helping to lead the Energy Efficiency and Housing Advisory Panel for the Climate Action Council, really delving into this topic of how do we heat and cool our homes and businesses in New York State in a world without fossil fuel. I would say the most significant recommendation coming out of that panel is that we need a clear regulatory signal that says we are phasing out the combustion of fossil fuel in buildings in New York State. And absent a clear regulatory signal with date certains, we just will not see the transformation in our building stock that we need. We need to be looking at something on the order of 200,000 building retrofits a year, every year, from today through mid-century. And just to sort of put that in place, that's probably an order of magnitude above what we are doing today. So we need a clear signal so investors can invest, so building owners can move forward. We need a clear regulatory signal that underscores that we are phasing out the combustion of fossil fuel. So where do we start? So the first place we start is that we have to stop designing and constructing new buildings with furnaces and boilers. We actually know how to do this. We know how to build new construction that is carbon neutral. And we are seeing through a variety of programs and initiatives across New York State that these new construction carbon neutral buildings can be cost competitive with fossil-based buildings. And they're better buildings with lower operating costs. So we need to amend the new construction code this year. The current code in New York State is based on payback and cost criteria, and it does not allow for the consideration of greenhouse gas emissions. And those two things very critically need to change in order for us to move toward an all-electric greenhouse gas emission-free new construction code. The recommendations of the panel was that we need to have in place an all-electric GHG-free new construction code by no later than 2025 for single family and low rise. And there are some members of the panel who would say it should be 2024, and then no later than the 2027 timeframe for multifamily and commercial. So this year, we need to change the code to fix it so that it can consider, and we can consider greenhouse gas emissions and move through the conventional code update cycle toward that all electric carbon neutral goal very, very quickly. So the most cost-effective thing we can do is to stop building new buildings that are burning fossil fuel. Now we have to get to the existing building stock. So we have 6 million buildings in New York State. And fundamentally, we can't improve and can't control what we don't measure. So we need mandatory benchmarking for large buildings statewide. We have it in New York City, and Chris can speak to that and the role that that benchmarking has played in allowing the creation of a building performance standard. So we need at the state level to have that mandatory benchmarking, that disclosure for large buildings. That will pave the way for a building performance standard. And we do believe we will need a building performance standard in New York State. The preliminary recommendation of the panel is that that building performance standard needs to kick in no later than 2030. So we need to pass mandatory benchmarking this year in our legislative cycle to put forward in motion the mandatory benchmarking that we can run out for a couple of years and then pivot to a performance standard for existing buildings. For homes, for single family homes, again, back to the, we can't fix what we don't measure. We need some form of a mandatory disclosure or a mandatory home energy report so that prospective home buyers know what they are walking into. They understand the energy use associated with a building, which is likely one of the largest investments, an individual will make in their lifetime. They understand the energy implications and the carbon implications. Now, the third thing we need to do is to really dig into the appliances that are in our homes and businesses. We have to move toward zero emission appliance standards. And that is what the Energy Efficiency and Housing Panel has proposed. So some of you may be aware that in the transportation sector, the state of New York and the governor has just signed a bill that will essentially require that by 2035, the only car you can sell in New York State is a zero emission all electric vehicle. We have to do exactly the same thing for appliances. And that is the same timeline that is being proposed for appliances. Now we can start a little earlier for single family homes. The recommendation is that the zero emission appliance standard should kick in 2030 for single family homes and for multifamily and commercial by 2035. So what this means is that after 2030, if you're a homeowner and your furnace and your boiler breaks or needs to be repaired, the only product you can buy is an energy efficient, clean electric heat pump. That's the proposal from the Energy Efficiency and Housing Panel that the council is deliberating. Now, what can we do today? We actually need to upgrade our appliance standards in New York State today. New York has a number of appliances that the state of New York has the regulatory authority to control, and we need to make those appliances as efficient as possible. We've done some analysis of that, and we believe that by upgrading our appliance standards in New York State, and again, these are maybe a few dozen appliances, we can actually save consumers in excess of $10 billion. So this falls in the absolutely no regret policy. We need to do that in 2022, and then we need to move toward zero emission appliances by 2030 and 2035. So that's sort of the core market signal, regulatory signal that we need to be sending to the market. And while we're doing that, while we're making progress on the legislative front in 2022, we do need to build the market for carbon neutral buildings, and we will need to increase funding to drive progress. So we are working across the state to build and construct and design proof points on the ground, with real buildings that show what a carbon neutral building looks like. What does a carbon neutral home look like? Multifamily building, commercial building. We're bringing investors to the table. We're bringing designers and architects to the table. We're working on everything from high-rise to low-rise buildings. We do need that progress on the ground. And that is the progress that will go hand in glove with an ambitious and aggressive legislative strategy. We also need to go from a building by building decarbonization model to a block by block and a community by community model. We really don't have the time to, when you think about what we need to do for those 6 million buildings, we've got to start developing some scalable models. And we're exploring a few of these with geothermal systems in New York State, community scale heat pumps, and we think this is an important strategy. We will need in New York to scale up financial support for energy efficient building envelope upgrades and heat pumps with priority focus on disadvantaged communities and low and moderate income New Yorkers. Roughly 45% of households in New York are low and moderate income consumers, and we are going to need to help those consumers take advantage of this transformation from a fossil-based system of heating homes to one that is cleaner. And that is likely going to require a range of new sources of funding, going beyond the usual suspects, going beyond utility ratepayer fundings to state sources and federal sources of funding. Last few things, and then kind of get into some of the challenges and issues, but we do need to build the workforce. This is absolutely critical. We are talking about tens and hundreds of thousands of workers that are going to be needed to facilitate this transformation. And we need more awareness at the public and consumer level. And this has to happen not just statewide, but all the way down to sort of trusted local sources. That's a critical part of this equation. From an LMI perspective, I want to underscore a point that was very critical to the energy efficiency and housing panel, and that is that we will need to couple public investment with regulatory protections so that LMI households and disadvantaged communities are protected from displacement and any threats to housing affordability. So I think that's a very important part of our policy agenda. And then lastly, we have to deal with this system-wide transition from fossil gas. One of the core recommendations of the panel is that the Public Service Commission, the state of New York, should launch a wide reaching planning process to transition from reliance on fossil gas in the gas system to a clean energy system. And this needs to be a managed transition, a just transition. We need to be eliminating subsidies from fossil fuels and establishing the right price signals. So that's the suite of recommendations that the panel put forward. And, you know, I will just say in the building space, there is really no one silver bullet to decarbonize buildings. And that became very clear, you know, to the dozen or so members that worked on this panel, that there's different strategies that will be needed for, you know, high-rise commercial buildings from single-family homes in upstate New York. And we just need to be mindful of that as we advance these recommendations. So we look forward to the council's a complete set of draft recommendations in 8 weeks. And then after that, we will have a 12-month-long public input process. But as I tried to communicate here, there's a lot of action that we need to take in 2022. We just cannot afford to miss the 2022 legislative session in terms of those policies that just need to happen under any of the scenarios that we looked at. So that's our 30,000-foot view of what the panel has advanced to the Climate Action Council.
Thank you, Janet. And wow, that's a lot. And we all need to be getting, rolling up our sleeves and getting busy. And so that's what I really wanted to talk, really kind of just explore with Sarah and Chris, you know, given the ambitious agenda that, you know, Janet laid out in terms of the Climate Action Council, many of these really bold policy initiatives and recommendations are also really aligned with NYSERDA's Building Decarbonization Roadmap. And what do you both see as, you know, some of the major challenges to, you know, getting all of these really, especially near-term actions moving in the state ASAP? Sarah, do you want to start?
Sure. So I think one of the things when it comes to near-term challenges is kind of thinking about what Janet said about no silver bullet is really going to be the solution. Is I think we need to design and launch some dynamic pilot projects across the state that look at the, you know, the challenges and the cost impacts and the operational expenses of transitioning affordable housing to both air source and ground source heat pumps, and to really learn the differences and the benefits of both of those. Additionally, one really simple thing I think we could do is right now the state has free energy assessments for 1 to 4 unit households, which is great. But we've gotten a lot of feedback from people that those energy assessments are incredibly biased towards fossil fuels. And so it would be really amazing to see some training for those assessors to really start educating homeowners and renters about what they can do to work on this transition. Additionally, it's really challenging when we're developing affordable housing when state agencies aren't in line with the implementation of the CLCPA. Affordable housing requires a lot of different agencies involved typically, and so it's difficult when we are getting different answers from different state agencies. And then the last thing I'll kind of speak about is data and outreach. So right now, Push Buffalo is running a Push for Clean Heat campaign, one of many clean heat campaigns across the state. And we're really trying to target people who right now have electric, propane, or oil heating because we think the value proposition for switching is really great. But there's no great data out there to identify those homeowners. And we know the utility companies have that. And it would be really amazing if we could see that data, and it would save us so much time and resources trying to find these different homeowners where the value proposition right now is really great. And I will leave it right there and hand it to Chris.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sarah and Janet and Lisa. Janet, that was a fantastic and comprehensive overview. I think really gives us a sense of the scale of the transition and the number of facets of our economy and everything touching buildings and otherwise that it implicates. And Sarah, I agree wholeheartedly with all the comments you just made. I think I would flag first a near-term opportunity in line with what Janet was saying, which is new construction, that we're really ready to go on new construction in many ways. And right now in New York City, there's a lot of momentum building for a bill to pass this year to require carbon emission standards for new construction that would have the effect of driving all electric new construction. So it's exciting to see that. I think there are a lot of details to figure out, but there's definitely a lot of momentum. And I think that's in the downstate region is probably the nearest term big opportunity that's on the table right now. I'd also echo Sarah's comments around data. That certainly from the perspective of identifying the best candidates for electrification, there are some big data needs there. And Janet was speaking to the power of the benchmarking data in New York City to unlock building performance standards and really sort of a new way of thinking about buildings. So I agree with both of those, and I would add to it that there's a strong role for bringing data to the market that helps give clarity on products, product availability, on costs, and specifically, I'm have in mind data that tracks heat pump installations in some sort of transparent fashion that helps both from a sort of market mobilization perspective, but also from a grid planning and sort of policy making planning perspective to understand what's happening as this electrification transition starts to roll out. And then secondly, on the cost side of things, NYSERDA has been doing some great work with a new construction competition called the Buildings of Excellence that has as a requirement submission of the cost data. And we've been at Urban Green helping to get some of that out to the general public and the market. And what it's showing is that the costs of new construction for high performance all electric buildings are really collapsing. In New York City, after incentives and tax credits, the incremental cost to build a high performance all electric building is only about 2%. And in the rest of the state, it's actually down to 0%. It's coming in at about even based on the projects there. So the more we can get that type of robust data that helps tell the story that we can do this, the better and easier it is to move the market. And then lastly, I would say one of the big challenges related to that is really education and communications. And Sarah, you touched on this a bit, but there are particularly downstate, there are some persistent myths, I think I would call them, that are informing skepticism around electrification. And one is that heat pumps won't save carbon until the grid gets cleaner. As I'm sure many of you know, downstate, we have a very fossil fuel dependent electricity grid. And I couldn't count the number of times I have heard some stakeholders voice that, well, heat pumps are great, but we got to wait until the grid's cleaner and then they'll save carbon. And that's simply not true. We've taken a deep look at this in some of our reporting. We put out a report called Going Electric and looked at the range of efficiencies of heat pump systems and current fossil fuel systems. And they save carbon in almost all cases, even with the downstate grid today that is so fossil fuel dependent. And then secondly, we also hear a lot that electrification is going to break the grid. How are we going to accommodate all this new demand for electricity? And I think messaging and communications around that, definitely a challenge and also an opportunity. And we're focused on that too at Urban Green. We have a report coming out by the end of this year, looking at a building level assessment of New York City and what electrification is going to do for the demand in those buildings, and then how it meets the ability of the electricity grid on a substation, on a network area, and on a feeder area to meet that demand. And the short story is there is ample headroom on the grid right now before the summer, the peak flips from summer to winter. There's about 3,000 megawatts on New York City's grid to fill in before electrification is even gonna threaten the grid in any real way. So what that means is we're ready to go, and we should start moving immediately. So getting that message to market, I think, is a really important piece too.
Thank you, Chris. Go ahead, Janet.
Just to build real quickly on that very last point. So our analysis statewide suggests that we flip from a summer peaking grid to a winter peaking grid with the ambitious electrification policies for transportation and buildings. That doesn't happen until 2035. So that means, we have 15 years of market growth, or read that as headroom, and time for planning to really manage that transition. So it's a great point.
And Janet, let me just ask you, and Sarah and Chris, were there recommendations that came out of the EE and housing panel that really look to get this planning underway so that, so if we have 15 years of headroom, is there going to be more comprehensive planning coming out from the state that is really going to ensure that we are going to both hit those targets in our electric sector, especially with regard to the downstate grid, but then at the same time that we're able to scale up, to these 2 million heat pumps by 2030, plus all of the stuff that needs to happen in the transportation sector in time. And so what is that state process looking like and coming, how does that look moving forward from the recommendations coming out of the Climate Action Council?
Sure. So I can try to hit that at the state level. Yeah. So when the Climate Action Council when the Climate Act set specific goals for renewables, right, which the rest of this conference is very focused on, 70% in 10 years and greenhouse gas emissions free in 20, we did commence a very large power grid study that is published and on our webpage. It's available now, that looks at, what might it take for this big transformation on the supply side to happen. As part of the work associated with what we call the integration analysis, which is where we're looking at this economy-wide transformation, we have looked at the kind of net impact of electrification and transportation and in buildings. And I would say to come up with sort of a first order assessment of our readiness and robustness. So that analysis is underway. I think one of our conclusions, and also the conclusions of another study that took place in New York City of Con Ed, National Grid, and the New York City Mayor's Office, is that a lot of that assessment is very localized. Like it could come down to, one small network, one block. So we do most definitely, need to sort of dig down in our granularity. over time. So that is work that has to happen. And then, as I touched on, we did one of the big planning recommendations, if you will, coming out of the panel was that the commission needs to really launch this comprehensive assessment of what this gas transition will entail. And part of the gas transition, is basically decreasing investment in our gas infrastructure, but then ensuring that our infrastructure and electrification is also ready. So those are some of the things that are underway and certainly work ahead. But the good news is that we have 15 years before the system would flip from a summer peaking to a winter peaking system. So we need to commence this planning now at the state level and at the granular utility level to be ready, but it all seems like it's quite doable given that time frame.
Thank you. And just to be clear, the gas planning proceeding docket is an active open docket in front of the Public Service Commission now, correct? And that's where we're talking about that this planning and assessment really needs to kind of, where the public and stakeholder engagement needs to be, is in that process, in that docket. Did I get that right?
Well, that planning docket is more narrow. I think the recommendation of the panel is that the scope of that really has to expand to encompass this broader, fairly significant transformation that we need to make. So I think the scope needs to expand a little bit more.
Perfect. Thank you. And I kind of want to just move us to a really important topic that I wanted Sarah to give some perspective on. And this rapid transition that we're undertaking here in New York, how are we ensuring that as we rapidly decarbonize and electrify our buildings, that our policies are accessible and equitable for communities and low income and disadvantaged communities around New York?
Sure, that's a great question and a great thing to focus on. So the first thing I would say is that we really need a one-stop application. Could you imagine if folks could go to one place, maybe it's a community organization, maybe it's online or both, and they could find out if they're eligible for SNAP, HEAP, as well as Empower to insulate their home. That would save community groups and the individuals applying so much time and be able to expand our reach. Additionally, it would create a really valuable opportunity for increasing language access since we only have the one application. The other thing that I like to think about a lot when I'm thinking about this transition is how we dealt with lead. Lead is something that is in both individual homes as well as in municipal infrastructure. And I would argue that we didn't do a great job on the lead transition when it comes to equitability. There's a lot of homes, especially low income homes and rental homes, that still have lead in them. And there's a lot of areas that still have lead in their drinking water. And so I think we really need to look at what happened there and think about how we can do better. Additionally, I would say that we have to not shy away from deferred maintenance. People who have restricted incomes, they might have leaks in their roofs, they might have old panel boxes, they might need additional electrical service, and we need to figure out a way to fund those repairs to both be able to insulate and weatherize the homes and prepare them for electrification. And then the last thing I'll say is that we need to increase access to on and off-site renewables for income restricted individuals and households. The 10% savings on community solar just isn't adequate. We've learned that energy burden has increased over time, and that 10% is just not enough to really address energy burden, especially when we look at electrification. And so we need to figure out how we can increase those savings from community solar programs, as well as figure out how to get people access to on-site solar if that's possible. And then actually, I have one more thing. There needs to be a financial mechanism for multifamily building owners to weatherize and insulate their buildings. Right now, I've talked with a lot of multifamily building owners who are interested in insulating their building, but it's really costly, and there's not a great financial mechanism for them, be it justifying it with savings or something else, to do that work. And so we need to figure out a way to get energy efficiency expanded significantly to renters, especially.
Thank you. Did Janet or Chris, did you want to comment?
I guess the only thing I will add is that one of the things that the Climate Act set in motion was a requirement that at least 35% of the benefits of the state's investments in clean energy and energy efficiency, with a goal of 40%, be targeted to disadvantaged communities. And this is something that we are working on intensely. And that is, ensuring that there's a sort of a strategic reset in terms of how we design and deliver our programs to make sure that low and moderate income consumers and under-resourced communities can participate and benefit from, and in some cases, share in the equity associated with this transformation. So it's another big policy overlay at the state level that's really important and was ushered in very clearly with the state's Climate Act.
Right. And I think, Chris, did you want to make a comment before we moved on?
Sure. I'll just add just quickly that this is an absolutely critical topic, of course, in New York City as well. And the major policy in place in New York is Local Law 97, putting carbon emission caps on buildings. And equity is really central to the way that law ended up being structured. There was a lot of concern about the potential to drive rent increases in certain types of affordable housing and a number of other related issues. And it's also central to how that law is being worked out through rulemaking and implementation, because balancing the climate focus with equity is difficult, and we need to. I think the challenge now is to make sure that we are bringing enough resources and tweaks to the structure of the law to help drive climate progress in buildings that were given a lighter compliance path because of concerns about equity and impacts on affordability. And so it's just an absolutely ever-present balance of considerations in how that law is being implemented.
Thank you. And while we have you here talking about Public Law 97, one of the things that I did want you to explore with you is how, from your perspective, I know Urban Green has played a really leadership role in the city in terms of implementation. And do you have any kind of top level thoughts for what are some lessons learned through that law and through implementation that we could really get out ahead of and apply at the state level as we're moving towards this rapid transition?
Sure, I think we've hit on a number of them already today, but definitely one top line one is the importance of engagement across the stakeholder spectrum. That was something Urban Green played a very strong role in the lead up to Local Law 97, bringing a lot of disparate stakeholders together around a table to fashion recommendations to inform the law. It's also now something that is central to figuring out the outstanding details of the law through an advisory board and working group process that's been set up under the law. And that's been, I think, critical to getting the answers right, but also to getting the stakeholder buy-in and sort of political support to move as aggressively and effectively as New York City is moving. Another big takeaway, particularly in the electrification space, Janet hit on it at the top, which is that we need really strong signals here. and support for the market. And at the center of Local Law 97 is a question about what the future grid is going to do, because it will be impactful on the obligations that building owners will face in terms of decarbonizing their buildings. And so making sure that there's alignment in Local Law 97 with the great progress at the state level in building out renewables and sort of getting those pieces together has been really critical to sending that long-term signal in Local Law 97 that says electrification is the long-term aim for the existing buildings here. Another important lesson learned, I think, really at the heart of the law is that this is uncharted territory for the building sector, and the leap from energy to carbon is very challenging. So for decades, building owners and managers have been thinking in terms of energy, and we're now asking them to think in terms of carbon. And Local Law 97 in one fell swoop broke down the classic barrier in the energy system between supply and demand. Building owners are now responsible for the carbon in the electricity or district steam that they're using, despite having minimal control over it. So that's a paradigm shift. It's a major transition for that regulated community to adapt to. It's absolutely critical, but it has also sort of unleashed a lot of really complex questions that the advisory board and working groups are working through now. And it's also raised the importance of driving electrification and energy efficiency at the same time. And so there are a lot of discussions in the Local Law 97 context right now about how to make sure it's achieving both those aims, because it is in many ways over time a very strong electrification driver, but somewhat less so an energy efficiency driver. So how do we get it to be a vehicle that, and I think that's super important for the state's thinking, and I think the state is thinking in that direction already, but balancing those two priorities over time to make sure this transition works as effectively and cost effectively as possible.
Great, thank you. And Janet or Sarah, did you want to have any interaction with Chris's comment?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add, that the point that Chris raised about Local Law 97 kind of breaking ground in terms of holding a building owner responsible for greenhouse gas emissions has definitely been an eye-opening experiment in public policy for sure, and is getting some really good thinking going on. But I will just share at the state level, the recommendation of the Energy Efficiency and Housing Panel was that when it comes to crafting regulations, we need to only hold the buildings accountable for what they can control. If a building owner can't control how quickly the grid is cleaned up, we're not sure if that's the lever to push. So I think where we're landing at the state level when we look at the whole big system is that we need to reduce energy consumption by like 50%. So that and then electrify 90% of the buildings, right? So it's sort of like we have to do both. But if we don't reduce consumption at the buildings, we're talking about a grid that is, much, much larger, more costly, consumes more land area. So I think at the state level, the panel was very focused on ensuring that when it comes to regulations, it's an unequivocal signal for efficiency, no guessing involved, because we absolutely need that, as well as electrification.
Great. Sarah? Any comment?
I don't have much to comment on Local Law 97 because it doesn't really have much stake in Buffalo, but it definitely is very interesting.
Awesome. All right. I just wanted to have one last and final question. We have a few Q&A and questions in the Q&A box. But given the timeline that we're looking at, and it was something that you really hit on early on in the conversation, Janet, about, we've got this year-long process in terms of comments for, what's coming out of the CAC, but we're really in this tension that we really need to do a lot of stuff in 2022. And I'm just wondering, one, how we're going to navigate that and how we're going to really, buckle in and like really move things forward. And do we have the, political will in the state of New York to really make these hard choices and really start making this happen? So Janet, do you want to start?
Yeah. So this is a great point. And I'm a big believer in sometimes, perfection is the enemy of the good. I know there are some stakeholders who believe, well, wait, the Climate Action Council's just teeing up this whole plan. There is a lot of discussion that will happen. We need to wait until we have the whole big thing figured out. And I don't, I would say even NYSERDA doesn't subscribe to that. And I think even our own governor doesn't subscribe to that. There are some things that actually make sense today as no regrets strategy under any of the scenarios that we're looking at. So I think the challenge for us, and I've tried to tee up a few of those, is to find those no regrets things that are in all of the recommended scenarios and move those in 2022 while we deliberate on the more complicated, nuanced elements of what's being put forward. And there's plenty of that to deliberate on. So that's what I think we need to do.
Thank you. Sarah and Chris.
So I think when it comes, sorry, Chris, did I jump on you?
No, go ahead, please, Sarah.
Okay. I think when it comes to political will, I think it's definitely there. And I think just like Janet said, there's a lot of things that we know how to do that we can agree on. Energy efficiency, I think, is one of them. So if we were to just, significantly increase the amount of homes that we're insulating and weatherizing while we're trying to figure out all of these difficult details, that would be really amazing. And that would save households money, which is so important right now.
Chris?
Absolutely. And I would add to that list, I think so the new construction piece we've hit on already, that's sort of being ready to go. And I think there is a lot of political will there. I don't know whether there's enough, but certainly plenty. With the existing buildings, I think there is a tendency to view it as all or nothing. And really there's a lot in between all and nothing. And so incremental electrification is a viable option in some building types. In a single family home, there's certain opportunities, but in larger buildings, you can be electrifying common areas, lower floors, just the hot water, et cetera. And so, staging this, I think there's political will if it's done in a smart and measured and thoughtful fashion. And so it doesn't mean a draconian mandate that comes down tomorrow, although as Janet said, we need that long-term signal. But there are lots of steps between now and that long-term signal that once the signal's in place, we can start taking and get the industry and get the state and get all the residents there.
Well, it seems like there are some really promising proposals in the state legislature this year to really move some of these items forward in terms of like getting, the new construction, some codes and standards. And, it looks, the legislature does have, a big accountability role in making sure that we are really set up for success, and we are going to achieve our CLCPA targets, and really making sure that we have the opportunities, to remove the barriers, to make that happen. So I think, stay tuned, and hopefully we can get some really great legislative action this year in 2022 in the session, early 2022, to really remove these barriers and get done what no regrets, and the things that we do have really big agreement across the stakeholders here and with the state. So thank you. I wanted to just go to some questions. I think I answered Chris Carrick's question. He had a very similar question, on the need for action in 2022 and the tension between the 12-month comment period. So I hope, Chris, we answered your question. There was a question for Sarah, and what would you like, the question is, Sarah, what would you like community solar projects to do more to help relieve energy burdens besides offering greater discounts?
One of the things that we are working on at Push, and that we work with groups across the state, is we'd really like these community solar arrays to be community owned and operated. And that sounds really great, but solar policy is really challenging to navigate. And so a lot of groups spend a significant amount of time kind of learning the different processes and navigating the legal challenges as well as the policy challenges, and working with the utility. And so I think if we could see some greater assistance from state agencies for community groups and nonprofit developers to really develop these large arrays, that would be a really amazing step to allow those community groups to figure out what the biggest benefit they can deliver are. And hopefully in the process as well, engage community members in learning about and then managing and working on these arrays to get more people involved in, community solar in general.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm gonna go, this one is a big question, and I know we only have 4 minutes left. But I'm gonna ask it because it's coming in the chat here. It says, what are the plans for changes to utility redesign for electrified properties, operating costs for electrified buildings that are hard to predict, and if there have been discussions about beneficial electrification tariffs? Who wants to take that one? Janet?
I can say a couple things on that.
Chris? All right.
Janet, you may be closer to any of the side thinking on it. So I don't think the plans are known or set yet. I think the topic has been floating out there, and we're likely to see some discussion on it in upcoming rate cases. I'll say two things. One is that this sometimes gets framed as just giving heat pumps a lower electricity rate to help address the operating cost challenges. And I don't think that's really the right way to think about it. Heat pumps right now actually make our grid more efficient because they are being used primarily in the winter when there is lots and lots of room on the electricity grid. So in a sense, it's not about a cheaper rate, it's about a rate that recognizes the value they're providing that is different. And so, that's sort of, I think, the lens to conceive of it in. And then secondly, I'll just say a couple ideas that I have heard. One is sort of tied into that incremental electrification idea in the context of larger buildings. If you can, in a larger building, there's a separate electricity meter for the common areas, the base building systems that aren't serving the tenants directly. One approach could be to think about creating something that is different for a base building multifamily electric meter that is paired with heat pump installations. You could, for example, put mini splits in a common area, or stairwells, or areas that you'd see some savings in and some incremental progress there. But beyond that, I think this is a big TBD that there are many stakeholders thinking about it, and it'll be a hot topic in the next year or two.
Great. Janet, did you have anything to add in our last minute?
I agree with what Chris said. I think that's absolutely what we're seeing at the state level. It's hotly discussed, it's hotly debated. Many believe, as Chris said, it's about creating a better rate, not necessarily a subsidy rate, but it's actually just a better rate, more reflective of costs. And that's what is being started to be explored at the state level. But I think that is in the work ahead category.
Well, that's going to be TBD at the Public Service Commission near us very soon. All right. Well, with that, I just wanted to thank Chris, Janet, and Sarah for this excellent discussion. And hopefully that, this year we're just really going to get a lot of action and movement forward in the rapid transition to electrify and decarbonize New York's buildings. So with that said, thank you all for being here. And I wanted to let you know that in the chat, you can return back to ACE New York's main conference. You can just link on in the chat to join back to the conference. And thank you all for taking part of your day to be with us.
Thanks.
Thank
Great
you
to
all.
participate. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.